The crimson dawn of June 4, 1942, cast long shadows across the Pacific Ocean as Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi, his weathered face betraying none of the uncertainty gnawing at his mind. 6 months had passed since Pearl Harbor's stunning success. Yet something felt different about this morning. The very air seemed charged with an electric tension that made seasoned sailors glance nervously at the horizon. The Japanese combined fleet had sailed forth with unprecedented confidence, their mighty aircraft carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu forming the steel heart of what many believed to be an unstoppable naval force. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's grand strategy seemed flawless on paper. Strike the American naval base at Midway Atoll with overwhelming force, draw out the remnants of the United States Pacific Fleet, and deliver a crushing blow that would force America to sue for peace. The plan bore the hallmarks of military genius, combining deception, surprise, and concentrated firepower in a symphony of destruction that had served Japan well. Throughout their lightning conquest of the Pacific. Below decks, Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, the same pilot who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, prepared his aircrew. With methodical precision, the men moved with the confidence of veterans who had tasted victory after victory, their Zero fighters and K torpedo bombers representing the pinnacle of naval aviation technology. These were the same pilots who had devastated the American battleship Roe, who had sunk the British battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse, who had swept Allied forces from the skies above the Dutch East Indies and the Philippines. Yet unknown to Nagumo and his formidable fleet, American cryptanalysts at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor had achieved what many thought impossible. They had penetrated the Japanese naval code JN-25, unraveling Yamamoto's carefully laid plans like a silk thread pulled from an intricate tapestry. Commander Joseph Rockford and his team of dedicated codebreakers had worked tirelessly through sleepless nights, their minds sharp as razor blades as they decoded intercepted transmissions that revealed not just the target, but the timing, the forces involved, and even the tactical approach the Japanese intended to employ. As referenced in declassified naval intelligence documents from the National Archives, the intelligence breakthrough represented one of the most significant achievements in cryptographic history, providing Admiral Chester Nimitz with an unprecedented advantage that would fundamentally alter the course of the Pacific War. Admiral Nimitz, understanding the magnitude of this intelligence windfall, had marshaled every available ship and aircraft to defend Midway. Task Force 16, commanded by Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard the carrier Enterprise, and Task Force 17, under Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher on the Yorktown, lay in wait northeast of Midway like patient hunters. The American forces were outnumbered and outgunned, their pilots hastily trained replacements for the veterans lost in previous battles. Yet they possessed something their Japanese opponents lacked: complete knowledge of enemy intentions and the desperate courage of defenders fighting for their homeland. The stage was set for a confrontation that would echo through history, where industrial might would clash with tactical brilliance, where the fate of nations would be decided by the skill of pilots and the accuracy of their bombs, and where the rising sun of Japanese naval dominance would begin its inexorable descent toward the western horizon. The pre-dawn darkness of June 4th shattered with the thunderous roar of aircraft engines as 108 Japanese planes lifted off from the fur carriers of the Kido Butai, their wings heavy with bombs and torpedoes destined for Midway's defenses. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga led this aerial armada toward the tiny coral atoll, his mind focused on the tactical perfection that had become the hallmark of Japanese naval aviation: precise timing, coordinated attacks, and overwhelming firepower, delivered with surgical precision. At Midway itself, radar operators detected the incoming strike force while they were still 150 miles away, their primitive but functional equipment painting green blips across cathode ray tube screens that told a story of impending doom. Air raid sirens wailed across the atoll as every available American aircraft scrambled skyward. Outdated Brewster Buffalo fighters, lumbering Catalina flying boats, and a handful of newer Grumman Wildcat fighters that represented the cutting edge of American naval aviation technology. The aerial battle that erupted over Midway resembled a deadly ballet, performed at 300 miles per hour, with Japanese Zero fighters dancing through the sky like deadly butterflies while American defenders fought with desperate courage against overwhelming odds. The Zeros, with their exceptional maneuverability and experienced pilots, carved through the American defensive formations like hot knives through butter, sending buffalo after buffalo spiraling toward the ocean in flames and twisted metal. Yet, even as Japanese fighters dominated the sky, Tomonaga's bombers encountered fierce anti-aircraft fire from Midway's ground defenses. The Coral Atoll had been transformed into a bristling fortress of guns, with every available weapon from heavy coastal artillery to small-caliber machine guns, trained on the approaching enemy formation. Black puffs of exploding shells filled the air like deadly flowers blooming in an aerial garden of destruction, and more than one Japanese bomber disappeared in a brilliant flash of orange flame and scattered debris. The bombing attack itself achieved mixed results that would prove crucial to the day's outcome. While Tomonaga's pilots successfully damaged hangars, fuel storage facilities, and some defensive positions, they failed to knock out Midway's airstrip or completely neutralize its striking power. As his formation wheeled away from the smoke-wreathed atoll, Tomonaga radioed a message that would seal the fate of the Japanese fleet. Second attack necessary to neutralize enemy base. This transmission reached Admiral Nagumo at the worst possible moment, just as his remaining aircraft were being armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for attacks on American naval forces that his reconnaissance planes had yet to locate. The Japanese commander faced a terrible dilemma: continue arming his aircraft for anti-ship strikes, based on the possibility of encountering American carriers, or rearm with land attack munitions for a second strike against Midway's still functioning facilities. Meanwhile, from Midway's partially damaged airstrip, every available American aircraft launched toward the Japanese fleet in a series of desperate, uncoordinated attacks that would test the courage of aviators flying obsolete aircraft against the most formidable naval force in the Pacific. Army Air Force B-26 Marauder bombers skimmed the wavetops at suicidal altitudes, their crews knowing they faced almost certain death, but pressing home their attacks with grim determination. That spoke to the American fighting spirit. The stage was set for the most crucial decision in naval aviation history, as Admiral Nagumo weighed his options while American dive bombers and torpedo planes converged on his fleet from multiple directions. The morning sun climbed higher in the tropical sky, its golden rays illuminating a seascape that would soon be transformed into a graveyard of ships, and the shattered dreams of empire. The flight decks of the Japanese carrier force buzzed with frenetic activity as Admiral Nagumo wrestled with the most consequential decision of his distinguished naval career. Below him, hundreds of aviation ordnancemen worked with desperate urgency, unloading armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes from aircraft that had been prepared for anti-ship strikes, replacing them with high-explosive bombs intended for land targets. The process required precious time that the Japanese fleet could ill afford, as American strike aircraft converged from multiple directions, like wolves closing in on wounded prey. At 0730 hours, a reconnaissance plane from the cruiser Tone finally reported the sighting that Nagumo had dreaded. 10 enemy ships bearing 010 degrees, distanced 140 miles from Midway. The message struck the Japanese command like a lightning bolt. But worse news followed 20 minutes later when the scout plane amended his report. Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. The revelation transformed the tactical situation in an instant. Yet Nagumo found himself trapped by his earlier decision to rearm for a second Midway strike. His aircraft were in various stages of ordnance change. Bombs and torpedoes scattered across hangar decks while aviation fuel lines snake between parked planes like arteries feeding a mechanical heart. To launch immediately would mean sending his aircraft against American carriers with the wrong weapons and insufficient fighter escort, while delaying would allow the enemy to strike first. Nagumo chose delay, a decision that would echo through history as one of warfare's most tragic miscalculations. He ordered his crews to reverse course once again, hastily rearming aircraft with anti-ship weapons while his combat air patrol of Zero fighters circled overhead like guardian angels protecting their vulnerable charges. The admiral's reputation for caution, which had served him well in previous engagements, now became a fatal weakness as precious minutes ticked away. The first wave of American attacks began arriving just after 0900 hours. Launched from Midway's battered but still functional airstrip, 6 Navy TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, flown by Marine pilots who had never before attempted a carrier attack, pressed home their assault with suicidal courage against the screening destroyers and cruisers of the Japanese fleet. The massive ships twisted and turned like dancers in a deadly waltz, their anti-aircraft guns filling the sky with steel and flame, while the slow, vulnerable American aircraft struggled to reach attack positions. Not a single torpedo found its mark, and 5 of the 6 Avengers fell to the guns of the Japanese defenders, their crews joining the growing list of American heroes who had given their lives in the desperate defense of Midway. Yet their sacrifice served a crucial purpose. They drew down the combat air patrol, forcing Japanese fighters to lower altitudes where they would be poorly positioned to meet the next wave of attackers. As referenced in official U.S. Navy battle reports archived at the Naval History and Heritage Command, the courage displayed by these early attackers provided crucial tactical intelligence about Japanese defensive patterns and forced enemy fighters to expend ammunition and fuel in low-altitude combat. The Army Air Force B-26 Marauders arrived next, their twin engines roaring as they skimmed the wavetops at masthead height in a desperate attempt to penetrate the Japanese defensive screen. Lieutenant James Murray led his formation through a wall of anti-aircraft fire so intense that the sea itself seemed to boil with exploding shells. Yet somehow his bomber survived to drop its torpedo just 500 yards from the carrier Akagi, before racing away through a curtain of tracers that lit up the morning sky like deadly fireworks. Again, no hits were scored, but the psychological effect on Japanese crews was profound. The relentless series of attacks, even by obsolete aircraft flown by relatively inexperienced pilots, demonstrated American determination and forced the Japanese to maintain constant vigilance while trying to prepare their own strike forces. Admiral Nagumo's carriers remained undamaged but increasingly vulnerable, their flight decks cluttered with aircraft, ordnance, and fuel lines that would prove tragically combustible. When the decisive moment finally arrived at 0920 hours, the most tragic and heroic chapter of the Battle of Midway began to unfold as 15 Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers from USS Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8 approached the Japanese fleet from the southwest. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led his men toward almost certain death. With the grim determination of warriors who understood their duty transcended personal survival, their obsolete aircraft carrying torpedoes that represented America's only hope of striking back at the seemingly invincible Japanese carrier force. The Devastators flew low and slow, their fixed landing gear and antiquated design making them sitting ducks for the swarm of Zero fighters that dove upon them like hawks, attacking a formation of geese. Waldron had trained his pilots relentlessly for this moment, drilling them in torpedo attack procedures until they could execute coordinated runs in their sleep. Yet no amount of training could compensate for the technological disadvantage they faced against Japan's premier naval fighters. Ensign George Gay, flying the squadron's tail-end aircraft, watched in horror as his comrades fell one by one to the guns of enemy fighters and the massive anti-aircraft barrage that rose from the Japanese fleet like a steel curtain. The Zeros attacked with methodical precision, their 20mm cannons and machine guns shredding the fabric-covered control surfaces of the American torpedo bombers, while enemy ships below poured thousands of rounds into the sky in a defensive barrage that turned the tropical morning into a vision of mechanical hell. Waldron himself died in the opening moments of the attack, his aircraft disintegrating under the concentrated fire of 3 Zero fighters who had singled him out as the formation leader. One by one, his pilots followed their commander into death, their burning aircraft cartwheeling into the Pacific in geysers of flame and steam. while their torpedoes ran harmlessly past their intended targets or exploded prematurely in the coral blue waters. Gay's devastator lasted longest, the young ensign somehow keeping his riddled aircraft airborne until he was almost within dropping distance of the carrier Kaga. Japanese fighters swarmed around him like angry wasps, their bullets punching through his wings and fuselage, while anti-aircraft shells burst close enough to rock his aircraft with their concussions. His radioman, aviation machinist's mate First Class Robert Huntington, died at his position while still firing his single machine gun at the attacking Zeros. His courage in the face of overwhelming odds epitomizing the spirit that would ultimately carry America to victory. Gay's torpedo run ended when concentrated fire from 3 Zero fighters finally crippled his aircraft, sending it plummeting toward the ocean in a controlled crash that somehow left the pilot alive in the water among floating debris and expanding oil slicks. From his hiding place under a floating seat cushion, Gay would witness the climactic moments of the battle, becoming history's only eyewitness to the destruction of the Japanese carrier force. From water level. Torpedo Squadron 8 had been annihilated, 15 aircraft and 29 men lost without scoring a single hit on enemy vessels. Yet their sacrifice, like that of the earlier attackers from Midway, served a crucial strategic purpose by drawing down the Japanese combat air patrol and forcing enemy fighters to low altitude where they would be unable to intercept the next wave of American attackers approaching from high above the cloud layer. Similar fates befell Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise and Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown, their slow, vulnerable aircraft falling to Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire in a series of attacks that cost the American forces 41 of 42 torpedo bombers launched that morning. The courage displayed by these aviators, flying obsolete aircraft against overwhelming odds with full knowledge of their likely fate, represented one of the most heroic chapters in American naval aviation history. Yet even as the torpedo squadrons died in flames and spray, their sacrifice was setting the stage for one of history's most decisive tactical reversals. As American dive bombers circled high above the carnage, waiting for their moment to strike at Japanese carriers, whose flight decks were crowded with fully fueled and armed aircraft preparing for their own attack. On the American fleet, the hands of destiny moved with mechanical precision as the clock aboard USS Enterprise reached 10:24 hours on the morning of June 4, 1942. High above the Pacific, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led 37 dauntless dive bombers in a desperate search for the Japanese carrier force, his fuel gauges showing dangerously low levels that meant his pilots faced a choice between finding their targets immediately or running out of fuel on the return flight to their carrier. McCluskey had made a crucial decision 15 minutes earlier, when his original search pattern failed to locate the enemy fleet. Instead of turning back, he had followed the wake of a Japanese destroyer that was racing northward at maximum speed, correctly deducing that the vessel was returning to rejoin the main force. This single tactical decision, born of experience and intuition rather than textbook doctrine, would prove to be one of the most consequential moments in naval warfare history. Below them, the 4 Japanese carriers had finally completed their frantic rearming process, their flight decks now crowded with fully fueled aircraft loaded with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes intended for the destruction of the American fleet. Admiral Nagumo had scheduled launch for 10:30 hours, just 6 minutes away, when his strike force would finally depart to deliver what many believed would be the knockout blow against the United States Pacific Fleet. The Japanese combat air patrol, drawn down to sea level by the successive waves of torpedo bomber attacks, was just beginning to climb back to altitude when McCluskey's dive bombers emerged from the cloud layer like avenging angels. The Zero fighters, their ammunition depleted and fuel running low from constant combat, found themselves in the worst possible position to defend their carriers to low and to slow to intercept high-altitude dive bombers beginning their attack runs. McCluskey's formation split with practiced precision, half the aircraft diving on the carrier Kaga while the remainder targeted Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's flagship. The dauntless dive bombers screamed downward at angles approaching 90 degrees, their pilots fighting G-forces that threatened to black them out, while maintaining the precise formation flying that would maximize their chances of scoring hits. On the maneuvering targets below, Lieutenant Richard Best, leading the attack on Akagi, released his 1,000-pound bomb at 1,500 feet, the weapon arcing through the tropical air, with mathematical precision toward the Japanese flagship's crowded flight deck. The bomb struck just aft of the carrier's midships elevator, penetrating the flight deck before exploding among the massed aircraft below in a fireball that instantly transformed Japan's premier carrier into a floating inferno. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Wilmer Gallagher's section scored multiple hits on Kaga, their bombs detonating among fully fueled aircraft and stacked ordnance to create secondary explosions that ripped through the carrier's hull like underground earthquakes. Within minutes, both Japanese carriers were blazing wrecks, their flight decks twisted ruins of steel, and their hangar spaces transformed into furnaces, hot enough to melt aluminum aircraft frames into molten streams. As referenced in post-battle damage assessments conducted by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, the concentrated nature of Japanese aircraft storage and ordnance handling procedures created catastrophic vulnerability to precisely targeted attacks, turning tactical advantages into fatal weaknesses within moments of the American dive bomber strikes. At almost the same moment, dive bombers from USS Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, found the carrier Soryu and delivered 3 devastating hits that set the ship ablaze from stem to stern. The Japanese carrier, which had participated in every major naval engagement since Pearl Harbor, died in flames and explosions that could be seen from 50 miles away, her experienced aircrew trapped below decks by fires too intense for human survival. In the span of 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's premier aircraft carriers had been transformed from instruments of imperial conquest into burning funeral pyres drifting across the Pacific swells. The carefully orchestrated Japanese attack plan lay in ruins along with the ships that were to have executed it, while hundreds of Japan's most experienced naval aviators perished in the flames or found themselves floating in life rafts where their extensive training became meaningless without aircraft to fly. The miracle at 1024 had shattered Japanese naval supremacy in a single decisive stroke, proving that industrial production and tactical innovation could overcome initial technological advantages when wielded by determined defenders fighting for their homeland's survival. As smoke columns from 3 burning Japanese carriers stained the pristine Pacific sky, Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi aboard the carrier Hiryu faced a decision that would define both his honor and his nation's fate. The sole surviving carrier of the once mighty Kido Butai, Hiryu represented Japan's last chance to salvage victory from the devastating surprise attack that had transformed the morning's confident advance into afternoon's desperate retreat. Yamaguchi, known throughout the Imperial Navy for his aggressive tactical brilliance and unwavering courage, refused to accept defeat even as rescue vessels struggled to save survivors. From his 3 sister ships, at 1300 hours, he launched 18 Aichi dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters toward the American fleet, determined to demonstrate that Japanese fighting spirit remained unbroken. Despite the morning's catastrophic losses, Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led the strike force toward USS Yorktown, the only American carrier his pilots could locate among the 3 enemy flattops that had delivered such devastating punishment to the Japanese fleet. The attack developed with the precision that had made Japanese naval aviation legendary. Throughout the Pacific, Kobayashi's bombers diving through intense anti-aircraft fire to score 3 direct hits on Yorktown's flight deck in a demonstration of skill that earned grudging respect even from their American opponents. The American carrier shuddered under the impact of Japanese bombs, her flight operations grinding to a halt as damage control parties fought fires and flooding that threatened to send her to the bottom of the Pacific. Yet American industrial engineering and damage control procedures proved superior to Japanese expectations. Within 2 hours, Yorktown's crew had patched her wounds sufficiently to resume limited flight operations, her smokestacks drawing clean. once again as her engineers coaxed maximum performance from damaged but still functional machinery. Undeterred by the apparent survival of his target, Yamaguchi launched a second strike at 14:30 hours, this time sending 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zeros to finish what the first attack had begun. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, wounded in the morning's strike on Midway but refusing medical evacuation, led this final desperate assault with the fatalistic courage of a samurai accepting death in service to his emperor. The second Japanese attack achieved what the first had only begun. Tomonaga's torpedo bombers penetrating Yorktown's defensive screen to deliver devastating underwater hits that stopped the American carrier dead in the water, listing heavily to port with her electrical systems failing and her engineering spaces flooding. Yorktown appeared doomed as her crew began preparing for abandonment, while her escorting destroyers moved alongside to take off survivors. Yet Yamaguchi's moment of tactical triumph proved strategically meaningless, for even as Yorktown died in the late afternoon sunlight, American scout planes had located Hiryu steaming alone across the empty Pacific. At 1600 hours, Enterprise launched 24 Dauntless dive bombers and 8 Wildcat fighters in pursuit of the last Japanese carrier, their pilots grimly determined to complete the destruction that had begun with the morning's miraculous attack. As referenced in official Imperial Japanese Navy war diaries recovered after the conflict, Admiral Yamaguchi's decision to continue fighting despite overwhelming odds reflected the traditional Bushido concept of honorable death rather than shameful surrender. Even when tactical situation offered no realistic hope of victory, Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, who had participated in the morning's attack on Kaga, led his formation through scattered cloud cover to find Hiryu racing northward at maximum speed, her flight deck crowded with the last operational aircraft of what had once been Japan's most formidable naval striking force. The American dive bombers rolled into their attack runs just as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, their 1,000-pound bombs glinting like deadly jewels in the golden tropical light. For direct hits transformed Hiryu into a blazing replica of her 3 sister ships, her hangar deck erupting in secondary explosions that sent aircraft parts and structural debris spinning hundreds of feet into the air. Admiral Yamaguchi, standing on his bridge as flames consumed his flagship, chose death over dishonor, remaining aboard the doomed carrier as she settled slowly beneath the Pacific swells. In the early hours of June 5th, the destruction of Hiryu marked the end of Japanese carrier aviation as an offensive force, the 4 flattops representing not just ships, but entire air groups of irreplaceable veteran pilots, whose experience could not be quickly rebuilt despite Japan's industrial capabilities. The dawn of June 5, 1943, revealed a transformed Pacific battlefield where the smoking hulks of 4 Japanese aircraft carriers drifted like funeral pyres across waters that just 24 hours earlier had seemed destined to become a Japanese lake. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, receiving reports of the catastrophe from his flagship Yamato 300 miles to the west, faced the terrible realization that his carefully crafted strategy for ending the Pacific War had instead sealed Japan's ultimate defeat. The magnitude of the disaster transcended mere ship losses, devastating though those were to a nation whose industrial capacity could not quickly replace such sophisticated vessels. More critically, Japan had lost the irreplaceable core of her naval aviation force, over 300 highly trained pilots and aircrew whose skills had been honed through years of combat experience, stretching from the China incident through the conquest of the Dutch East Indies. These men represented a human investment that could never be recovered, their expertise dying with them in the flames of their carriers or in the oil-stained waters of the Pacific. Yamamoto's invasion fleet, stripped of its aerial striking power and facing the prospect of American reinforcements converging from across the Pacific, had no choice but to retreat toward Japanese home waters. The transports carrying troops intended for Midway's occupation turned back toward their bases. There, frustrated soldiers wondering how victory had been transformed so quickly into defeat. The dream of extending Japan's defensive perimeter to include the Hawaiian Islands died with the carriers, leaving the Empire's eastern flank exposed to American counterattack for the first time since Pearl Harbor. Captain Mitsuo Fukuda, pulled from the water by a Japanese destroyer after Akagi's sinking, would later write that June 4th represented the moment when Japan's offensive capability died forever. The man who had led the Pearl Harbor attack now found himself a witness to the Empire's naval decline, his own survival seeming almost cruelly ironic as he watched rescue vessels search for his comrades among the floating debris and spreading oil slicks. For the United States, Midway represented vindication of American industrial might and tactical innovation over Japanese technological advantages and combat experience. The victory demonstrated that democracy's capacity for rapid adaptation and massive production could overcome authoritarian efficiency when properly directed by competent leadership. Admiral Nimitz's decision to trust cryptographic intelligence and risk his remaining carriers in a defensive battle had proven that calculated risks could yield strategic dividends, far exceeding their potential costs. The battle's aftermath revealed the fundamental economic realities that would determine the Pacific War's ultimate outcome. American shipyards were already laying down dozens of new carriers, whose production schedules would deliver unprecedented naval striking power within 18 months, while Japan's more limited industrial base struggled to replace even single vessels lost at Midway. The Essex-class carriers already under construction would dwarf their Japanese counterparts in both size and aircraft capacity, representing American determination to achieve victory through overwhelming material superiority. As referenced in post-war economic analysis conducted by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Japan's inability to match American industrial production rates made long-term victory impossible. Once the Empire lost the initiative and experienced pilot cadre that had provided temporary tactical advantages during the war's opening phase, yet, perhaps most significantly, Midway shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility that had paralyzed Allied resistance. Throughout the Pacific, news of the victory spread rapidly across a world hungry for evidence that Axis powers could be defeated, providing crucial morale boost to resistance movements from the Philippines to occupied Europe. The battle proved that superior technology and training could be overcome by determination, intelligence, and industrial capacity when properly coordinated by competent military leadership. The setting sun on June 5th cast long shadows across the Pacific battlefield, illuminating an ocean forever changed by 36 hours of combat that had decided the fate of nations and empires. Japan's naval ambitions had indeed turned to smoke among the scattered wreckage of her carrier force, while America's industrial democracy began its long march toward ultimate victory in a global conflict that would reshape the modern world. The Battle of Midway had ended not just a naval engagement, but an entire chapter of human history, marking the moment when the rising sun of Japanese empire began its inexorable descent toward final defeat.